So welcome back, everyone. I have the great privilege of introducing our keynote speaker, Mark Holden. Mr. Holden is the Senior Vice President, General Counsel, and Corporate Secretary of Koch Industries. I will share, and you do have his bio in its pockets. He has a number of other important titles and chairmanships, but what I want to point out is that he's a leading voice for criminal justice reform. And I hope you can maybe share a little bit about that journey. He's known for building bridges between traditional political opponents on both left and right. And I would just share on that point that the first time that I heard about Mark, I was working for the Obama administration and in the staff meeting with folks that were working on sentencing reform that Valerie Jarrett was chairing, and she just made a comment in passing. I just came from this great meeting with Mark Holden from Koch, and it was so great. And I have to say, candidly, I was surprised and intrigued. Surprised because I knew the Obama administration did not necessarily see eye to eye on, certainly for Koch brothers, but absolutely intrigued that there had been this opportunity for common cause around an issue that was so important. And as I understand it, you guys are still friends, and I think that's it's a wonderful thing to see. I'll also share that I also had the opportunity to hear Mark speak last year at a Smart on Justice conference at John Jay University that Carter Stewart from the Draper Foundation, who is here with us today, and want to acknowledge that, supported. So it all comes full circle, but I am so pleased that we have you with us today. Welcome.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Monica, for that very nice introduction. That meeting with Valerie Jarrett back in, it was like 2015, I forget, but I was supposed to be meeting with someone else. I walked in and she was sitting there. I was like, oh man, this is going to be trouble. But it was a great meeting, and we talked about actually ban the box back then in that particular specific meeting, and then went on to other issues. And when she had to leave early, I said, it's very nice to meet you. And she said, it's very nice to meet you. And she said, well, you've made my day. And I said, wow, you must have been having a really bad day, but I'm glad I could help. But no, it was a great partnership. And like you said, I'm talking with some other folks here just before the start of the discussion. And you talk about an issue that now unites left, right, and center. It wasn't that way. When I came out of law school in 1988, and that was the height of the tough on crime era. And then we went from 88 to 94, where the Democrats doubled down on it with the crime bill, but we had the Willie Horton stuff. And now it is an issue that unites everybody. But I want to thank you all for having me here today. And I'm going to talk about why it's so important, criminal justice reform, but not much, because I think most everybody here is on board, so I won't spend a whole lot of time on that. I'm going to talk about why we're involved. I'm going to talk about my involvement from a long time ago when I was a kid. And I really like starting off, though, with just to show the coalitions that have been built. And this is an old slide from a few years ago, but this is the left, center, and right coalition that's been working on these issues. And I've left groups out, probably some groups that are here today, and I apologize, but like I said, it's an old slide, and I'm kind of lazy, so I go with old slides. But it's really, a lot of it's just based on Charles Koch and his vision, and in particular, he is a huge devotee of Frederick Douglass, and Frederick Douglass, who said, I will unite with anybody to do right and with nobody to do wrong. And so we've always thought of ourselves that way. Whatever the issue is, we try to work with someone. Even if it's a 5% issue, we agree on something. Let's work on that. Let's build a coalition, and let's see what we can get done. So it has been totally bipartisan from the beginning, as it needs to be. Left, right, and center working together to make the system safer, better, less punitive, more about rehabilitation and redemption. Totally different than like I said, the era I grew up in. And it's a great thing to see for sure. And I think that what we've seen the last 10 plus years, and Michigan has been a leader, I think, in a lot of ways on this, that there are better ways to do this than locking people up forever based on fear and emotion, thinking that that's somehow going to, keep us safe. It didn't keep us safe, and I don't think it ever will keep us safe. But going from, like I said, the Willie Horton era to the super predator era to where we are today, it's a wonderful thing, and I thank all of you and others in this movement who have made it happen. It's really a good thing to see, and hopefully we can keep it going. But why are we involved in this? I mean, this is truly a righteous cause at the end of the day. I mean, there's no doubt about it. And it's really, in my opinion, I think what we've done in our criminal justice system, and I'll cede the fact that it was based on good intentions, but the last 40 years, I think that it's been, at least in my estimation, if not the most serious, but the most prolific injustice of our time. I don't know how else to put it, the way that we've decided to treat people in the system. And it's a lot of ways, with no disrespect to people who were involved in getting it set up. I know everybody did the best they could. In a lot of ways, everything that we did and everything we've done up until the last 10 years or so in the States has been the exact opposite of what we should have done. So I'm glad we're finally making some progress. The federal system has a way to go. We'll talk about that. But why are we involved in criminal justice reform? 3 reasons. One is it's morally the right thing to do, constitutionally the right thing to do, and fiscally it just makes sense. And it's based on a vision that we have of a society of equal rights and mutual benefit where people succeed by helping others achieve their potential so they can transform themselves and their communities and create virtuous cycles of people adding value to other people's lives and helping others succeed. So what does that mean? We want to help people remove the external barriers to them fulfilling their potential or having a chance in life. And there's a lot of external barriers out there that we've set up either just through policy or just our own biases. And at the top of the list has got to be the criminal justice system. We've seen it the last 40 years how the way we've handled things has created generational poverty and generational incarceration, which is really just not a good look for a country like ours. I'll just put it that way. So the moral case is pretty simple, and Brian Stevenson, as usual, says it best. We've got a system that treats the rich and guilty better than the poor and innocent. We've also got a system that really is, in my opinion, the epitome of a failed big government program that picks winners and losers. And if you've got money, you've got resources, you'll probably be okay. And if you don't, you're probably not going to be okay. And sometimes guilt and innocence don't matter. And that's really tough for me to say that, but we all know it's true. I hate to say it. It makes sense constitutionally. Almost half of the Bill of Rights deal with criminal justice issue. 4 of the 10 amendments to the Bill of Rights, the first amendments to the Constitution, the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 8th amendments, which are God-given inalienable rights. They were sending us a warning back then. The founders got a lot of things wrong, but they nailed this one. And the biggest threat to life, liberty, property, and the pursuit of happiness would come through the criminal justice system. And guess what? They were right. The last is the the fiscal case, which is the moral case as well. And what do I mean by that? Well, we've seen the reforms that started in Texas and that have spread to other states like Michigan, South Carolina, Delaware, et cetera, Georgia. We've seen them. They started when someone questioned building a new prison for another $2 billion on another prison because we're expanding too much with our prison population. It happened in Texas. And what happens is when people start to look at that and they see who's in prison and why they're in prison and how much it costs, that leads to reforms. That's what's happened in all the states. And the states have led on it because they can't print money like the federal government does. They have to live within their means, which is an interesting concept, I think. So that's the reason why you see a lot of these reforms, because they work. They keep people safer. They save money. They save lives, keeps law enforcement safer. And it's the fiscal is the moral case, because if you're not locking up people who don't need to be in prison at all, probably, they either need mental health treatment or they need some skills training, who aren't violent offenders. If you're not locking them up, or if you're keeping people in prison for a shorter period of time and actually training them and educating them and giving them therapy and helping them work through the trauma that most people who end up in the criminal justice system, at least the ones that I'm familiar with, have been very much traumatized throughout their lives and hurt people. So if you're not doing that, and you keep those people out or in for a lesser period of time, you've got lots of money to spend on things like mental health treatments, schools, roads, and it just makes sense. So those are the 3 main reasons. For me, personally, I grew up in Worcester, Massachusetts, and the best job I ever had before I went to law school, I was a prison guard for a couple of years. And while I was a prison guard, there are a number of kids, more than I'd like to admit, who I grew up with who were in prison, who were incarcerated, went to the same schools as me, same churches. We played baseball together. I lost track of them about in middle school, and I got reunited with them when I was working at the prison. And really, there was not much difference between me and them, except for the fact I think my parents probably rode me harder than their parents may have. And I got lucky and didn't get caught doing a lot of dumb things. I did dumb things, nothing really violently crazy or anything, but it doesn't matter. If you don't have resources, you get caught up in the system, at least where I'm from, my neighborhood, you were pretty much done for life. And that's the way it's been for a long time. And that didn't seem right to me as a knuckleheaded 18-year-old, and it doesn't make sense to me as a guy who's 55 years old. The other job I had after that, I was a janitor in a plastics factory. And every day they'd bring in people from the work crew, from the work release program, right outside of the facility where I worked, the factory. And these were 8 to 10 guys, the same guys pretty much for the 2 years I worked there. And 8 to 10 people, 8 of them were good guys, 2 weren't. But I mean, that's better than most of the average you're going to meet with anyone who isn't in prison. But they had made these bad decisions, dumb mistakes, committed crimes, and we just had no off-ramps to opportunity back then. They were marked for life. And it was really, for me, again, at an age when 18-year-old boys are not known for introspection, at least I wasn't, it didn't make sense to me. And it still doesn't make sense. And, at the end of the day, what we're doing now, by and large, is better, but we have a long way to go. These are our guideposts to reform. Nothing fancy here. Public safety's got to be top of mind. Keep communities safe. Equal rights, meaning everybody gets equal justice. We know that isn't the case today, unfortunately. We could talk about that a lot, but you all know that as well. And then finally, providing real second chances for those who are seeking redemption and need a second chance. And some of them may need more than a second chance or a third chance, perhaps, particularly for a lot of people who got caught up in the system. Not excusing any criminal behavior, but many people who got caught up in the system never really had a first chance. So we need to realize that as well. So this is kind of a really rough outline of what we'd like to see the reforms look like. There's a lot of detail that's not in here. You look at the legislation we'd like to see passed. We think that all laws, period, need to have intent standards in them. People shouldn't go to prison unless they were willfully and had knowledge, acted willfully and had knowledge. It shouldn't be for accidents or mistakes. We think that we should get rid of asset forfeiture. I'm a sucker for the Bill of Rights, like I said, and I think it's completely unconstitutional. And I think it really puts law enforcement in a difficult position, the way we're asking them to be revenue generators, whether it's fees and fines or these types of things like asset forfeiture. It's not good, and it's unconstitutional. Real quick, prosecution, nothing against prosecutors, but they got way too much power. They become the most powerful individual in our system, and that isn't the way it should be. And the court systems itself, we believe in Sixth Amendment. I just love the Bill of Rights. The Sixth Amendment talks about the right to counsel if you are charged with a crime. We don't honor that, even though 80% of the people in the system need a lawyer. They don't get one or they don't get a full-time lawyer. We need to fix that. In my opinion, you shouldn't be able to prosecute someone because the government's supposed to provide you with a lawyer. If you don't provide them with a lawyer, you should be able to prosecute them. But that isn't happening right now either. The sentencing, I'm a big believer in judges, punishment fitting the crime. And I know in Michigan you've gotten rid of, I think it's mandatory minimums, or you've reduced them at least. That's good. I understand there's a need for some mandatory minimums at the federal level. They're so in love with them, even though there's absolutely no evidence. They keep us safer. In fact, I think the evidence is the other way. But we'd like to see sentencing go back to the way it was with Article III courts, kind of deciding the issues and letting them make the calls, and not a bunch of people who are in Congress and then letting prosecutors run the show. We just don't think that makes a lot of sense. I've already talked about mandatory minimums. Collateral consequences is an area where it's really upsetting what happens. And we basically have a system, and everyone knows what collateral consequences are. I'm talking about the second prison. Oftentimes people have no idea it's coming, but once they're out of prison, they can't get jobs, they can't get housing, they can't get loans, you name it, and it ends up, leading someone back to prison. But we have a system right now, by and large, particularly if you don't have resources, it's extremely punitive, and it over-criminalizes, over-prosecutes, over-sentences, over-incarcerates, and over-burdens. Good example of this and how out of control it is this slide shows that at the founding, there were 3 federal criminal laws, which were counterfeiting, piracy, and treason. So you look at the trend. So it's 3 at the founding. Everything else was left to the states, like, again, 10th Amendment requires, or said it should. By 1900, you got 3 dozen. By 1980, the start of the war on drugs, with at least 3,000. Today, it's anywhere from 5,000 to 6,000. But we don't know because the Department of Justice has asked, Congress has asked the Department of Justice to tabulate how many federal criminal laws there are a couple of times now. And they haven't been able to do it. They said there's too many, they can't do it. And like I always like to say, only in Washington, D.C. would that be an acceptable answer. But that's where we are, and that doesn't even include the 300,000 plus regulations in the federal code that also have criminal provisions. So it's a big deal, the number of laws and regulations we have out there. It gives prosecutors and law enforcement infinite powers to, get people ensnared in the system. I'm not saying they do it, in a bad way, but it just does. There's so many laws out there. Some estimate people commit 3 felonies a day, if you believe some of the data out there. And that's led to this. 1 in 3 people in this country have some type of criminal record. That's as many people with a criminal record in this country that have college degrees, which is pretty shocking, I think. And collateral consequences are a major reason why we have had such an explosion in the prison population, people returning to prison again and again and not being able to get out of that system. To me, it's one of the most pernicious outcomes of our criminal justice system is the way we treat people who have paid their debt to society. It's just wrong. It's totally immoral, right? So, the idea is, right, you commit a crime, and you should pay for that. You should have to go to prison. You commit a crime, you go to jail, you pay restitution, whatever it is. And we don't forgive the debt, though, because the definition of justice is just behavior or treatment. And never forgiving a debt, even though it's paid, that's not justice. It's wrong. It's the exact opposite of justice, and that's what happens with the collateral consequences we have in our country. And these are one-size-fits-all restrictions by and large. I know that Michigan's made a lot of progress in the past couple of years. I just heard this morning or this afternoon that they're changing some of the rules around occupational licensing, which is great. I'm not a big believer in one-size-fits-all, particularly in a country as great as ours, particularly based on individual liberty. I believe that everybody should get their rights back once they've been released from prison, paid their debt to society, and I mean everything, including voting rights. And I think that there are people who probably need to be kept out of certain occupations or certain areas, but let's do it that way. Let's do it on each individual. Not everybody gets nothing. It should be individual by individual. I think that's a much better way to do things because if we treat people coming out of prison, returning to society as second-class citizens, they're going to act that way. And if we don't give them opportunities, we're just making things worse for them and for all of us. And what it's led to, again, in the past 40 years now, is the world's largest prison population by absolute numbers and the world's largest prison population by rate of incarceration for industrialized nations. So 4% of the world's population, like 23% of the world's prisoners. What has that led to? Well, you can see that graph. This is from 1980 to today. There's around 2 million people in prison. There were 500,000 or so back in 1980 at the start of the war on drugs. And you could see that has really escalated and exploded in the decades since then. And that's an 850% increase in federal prisoners since 1980 and a 500% increase including state inmates. And this is kind of, when I read this was pretty shocking, but PolitiFact said it's true, so it must be true. From 1990 to 2005, we built a new federal or state prison or jail every 10 days. It's pretty crazy. So you look at the spending on that, you look at what we spend on education in this country per capita versus what we spend on incarceration, I think that's a disgrace. I think, especially for the outcomes we generally get on incarceration. You get 3 to 4 times more per capita spent on incarcerating people, locking them up, than we do on K through 12 education each year in this country. And I think that goes back to, In our personal lives, we spend money on what we think is important. It's now different in our civic life, in our society, and those numbers tell me that we think it's more important to lock people up than it is to educate them. I know that's not true, but you are what you eat, and you definitely are what you spend. But the good news is that is changing some, and it needs to, because as everybody here knows, it's not just the individual that goes to prison, it's the whole family, right? And so an incarceration and then a criminal record create barriers to rising out of poverty for the people returning home, the formerly incarcerated, and for their families. And it's a big crisis. We've got a situation where there's almost 3 million children who have a parent or parents in prison. 2/3 of them are going to have their own issues in the juvenile or adult systems. And it's created, as I mentioned earlier, this generational poverty trap. And the other thing I'd like to mention is there's 1 in 38 people in this country are under some type of control from a correctional perspective. That's like almost 7 million people. That just, again, these numbers just don't make sense to me. And a lot of it has to do with how we chose to fight, quote unquote, the war on drugs. It didn't work. Hate to say it, I'm not a drug guy, but drugs won. The rate of drug usage and the number of drugs absolutely used in this country keeps going up. So whatever we're doing isn't working, and it makes sense that it didn't work, because you can't fight something like that that's so complicated, which has mental health issues, poverty issues, and then there is a criminal element that needs to be dealt with. But when you treat everybody in the system like they're a criminal and put them in prison for a long time, it's no surprise we got the outcomes we did. And that's what we're trying to correct for now, and the states have shown that. And one of the Villanova study from 2009, what it said was if we had not had this over-incarceration, the mass incarceration because of all the mandatory minimums and the war on drugs, poverty would have decreased by more than 20%. That's a big deal. I mean, if we could do that still, if we can reduce recidivism and keep reducing crime rates, we're going to have one hell of a society. And again, I think we have the greatest country on earth, but we have so much potential. And the good news is right now with the economy, it's 3.9, the unemployment rate. But if you're formerly incarcerated, it's like 5 times that for some of them. So it's like it's back in the Great Depression. So we got a long way to go still here. But there's still good news on the front on that as well. As you all know, in the states, start with Texas. And this always surprises people, but you all know the story. Texas since 2007 has closed 8 prisons, has its lowest crime rate since the 1960s, and it's saved over $4 billion in taxpayer money. And they started the revolution back when Rick Perry was governor. Now he's in the Trump administration, and he is still a very strong advocate for criminal justice reform. He's been one of the people that's really helped, along with Jared Kushner and others, to get the president to a much better place on that, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But that's one of the success stories. Georgia, another success story, another red state. I'm not just picking red states because I'm seen as conservative. I'm just saying it always surprises people when red states have led on this. It's kind of Nixon to China or whatever you say. But you've got, and I don't know why I brought up Nixon. That was probably wasn't right. But anyway. So in Georgia, you've got fewer people in prison compared to what their projections were a few years ago. Again, their lowest crime rate in over a decade, and they've saved over $420 million in taxpayer money, which is great. You here have done a lot of really good work on criminal justice reform, downward trend in the crime rate, closed 11 prisons, over $221 million saved in taxpayer money between 2010 and 2015. The recidivism rate down to 28.1%. From 45% several years ago, and it's in the 1990s. It's the lowest in the history of the state and among the top 10 states in the country. And Michigan is recognized as a national leader in corrections for a lot of reasons. Like I was talking to someone earlier, this past winter, went up to Hanlon State Prison, and it blew me away. And it really, for me, in a lot of ways, is the gold standard of what we should be trying to do in all our prisons, educating people, and then skilling them up, giving them skills and occupations, and then therapy as well. So when they come out of prison, they don't go back, and they're positive members of their society. I think you're really getting that right. And again, none of this is rocket science, and it's not even political science, which is my major. It goes back to what I saw growing up in Worcester. The kids I grew up with who ended up in prison didn't go to school, their parents weren't around or didn't give them any oversight, they'd had no positive role models in their life, they really didn't have any opportunities, and once they got into the system, they were done. There was no programs back then. There are programs now, but the things that keep you out of prison by and large, there are always exceptions, are, you're educated, you're skilled, you have an opportunity, you have someone you don't want to disappoint, a mentor, something like that, you probably won't go to prison. And if you don't have that and you end up in prison, guess what? You need even more coming out. So that's why reentry is so important, and you all have done a lot of good work on reentry reform as well, although there's a long way to go everywhere on that. These are some other legislative accomplishments that you all know about in the past several years here in Michigan, and maybe it's because the bar is so low around the rest of the country on these things, but I think you all know better than me. I think what you're doing is really good, but there's so much more we can do, and I want to talk about some of that. First, I want to also hit on some of the federal issues before I get to Safe Streets and Second Chances, which is our new pilot program for reentry in 4 states and hopefully coming to Michigan soon. Before I get to that, I do want to talk about the First Step Act. Are you all familiar with that? It's the House bill. It's a prison reform bill in the House of Representatives, federal bill, that would take all the different learnings from data-driven learnings, obviously, and evidence-based. Everything we need to do now in the criminal justice system needs to be based on evidence and data, and we can do that now more and more, not on fear and emotion, because we saw what happened with fear and emotion in the 80s and 90s. But the prison reform legislation, the First Step Act, it was Doug Collins and Hakeem Jeffries. So you have a really conservative guy and a really liberal guy from New York came together, and it's all about rehabilitation. And it's about risk assessments, and it's about data-driven programs. It's going to allow outside groups to come into the Bureau of Prisons and do programming. So you'll have like the prison fellowship potentially. You'll have the prison entrepreneurship program, Hudson Link. There are a number of different groups around the country, some here as well, who will be allowed to come in. And that's important because the federal system doesn't have a lot of programming. I mean, it's one of those things that none of them have really done a whole lot on programming. But we've been working with the administration and with Congress on it, and I've urged everyone I've talked to about it to come up and see Handlin State Prison, because I do think it is the gold standard for how we want to do this prison reform. And it's the whole idea is that you're going to be able to save money, save lives, reduce recidivism, keep families together, all the things we want to do, protect public safety, keep law enforcement safer, et cetera. The evidence-based programs will be a lot on education. The RAND study from 2013 with DOJ showed that for every $1 spent on in-prison programming, you save up to $5 of future incarceration costs, and it reduces the individual's likelihood of recidivating 43%. So again, this is not rocket science. People who are educated, who are skilled and have a positive path and have a mentor, someone that will help them, they're probably going to succeed in life. And if they, like I said again, if they don't get it early in life, they need it late in life. The First Step Act will also allow, try to keep families closer together. So it'll be a 500-mile rule based on risk of the individual and space, so families can see their loved ones, keep that connection going. That's also very important. And there's a number of other ones as well, other reforms as well. One that they put in, which I didn't know we needed to do, but I guess we do. They'll know that this bill, it passed through the House, by the way, 360 to 59. This bill will ban the practice of shackling female inmates while they're giving birth. Now, that was one of those things I didn't think we'd need a law for, but I guess it's good this will pass, hopefully, and that will happen. But ultimately, it's going to be better outcomes for everybody, saving money, saving lives. It's in the Senate now. In the Senate, the math is always more difficult. It's right now, it was supposed to be something we thought would get through already, but they tried to add sentencing reform to it, some mini sentencing reforms, some reforms that are so common sense that Jeff Sessions is actually in favor of them. I kid you not. There's not a will to do it before the midterms, so it's been shut down in the Senate. We think it's going to happen after the midterms, although this is an issue, this bill, these issues poll really strongly across the political spectrum now. 70% or more support rehabilitation and common sentencing reform in all parties, and these are likely voters in the midterms. So we're going to wait and see what happens after the midterms. It should go through. Some say there'll be 75, 80 votes. We only need 60. And right now, it was shut down just because there's still this concern about the Willie Horton era among some Republicans. I won't name any names other than Senator Cotton. And he's been driving it, doing Jeff Sessions' bidding, but we're hopeful we can overcome that and get that done. We're going to work hard to do it. We think these reforms, again, in the sentencing area, make a lot of sense, too. And so to the extent we can start to stop the inflow of people into prison and keep our communities safer, and to the extent we can keep people from coming back again and again, that's the goal. That's what you all have done. That's what we need to do at the federal level as well. And then we need to change pretty much all the other laws around drugs and treat drugs, try to treat them the way we talked about treating them in CARA, not locking everybody out, but treat it like a public health issue and a mental health issue. And then if there's a criminal element, deal with it that way, but don't just lock everybody out. So that's where we are on that. The last piece at the federal level, clemencies, you probably have seen some of the coverage of that. The president is very interested in it. I think what he's seeing is what a lot of people see when they get involved, well, as they become president, but when they have an investigation going on, everybody starts to better understand the power of prosecutors and what that means. And I think the president's feeling that. But also to his credit, and to Jared Kushner's credit, bringing him along both on prison reform, because he gets that now. He's a big proponent of it. And on the pardons and the commutations, he commuted Alice Johnson, who was denied 3 times before, but was commuted by Trump, and it was the right thing to do. I don't think she needed to be in prison 21 years, let alone life sentence. And I met her. She's an amazing person. I'm sure you all have heard her or met her as well or heard about her. But what this has done, it's, I think, given the president an idea about when we talk about sentencing reform, we're talking about people like Alice Johnson, people like Chris Young, who's in Tennessee, who is 30 years old now, got a life sentence. He's a 2-time, he was arrested and convicted of possession of crack cocaine earlier in his life. Then he was arrested at the scene of a takedown of a drug gang in Tennessee. He was not he was not a major player. He was at the scene, but it was 3 strikes and you're out. So he's in prison for life right now. The good news for him is that Brittany Barnett, one of my good friends at SMU, who does a great job on commutations, is representing him, and she also represented Alice Johnson. And the better news for him is that Kim Kardashian's advocating for him, because that matters right now. And I'm okay with that. We were at a meeting with her the other day on these issues. They're actually talking about reforming the way that clemencies are done generally in the federal system. Not through DOJ, which would make sense since they have an inherent conflict of interest, and it's not always been that way anyway. It's only since the 80s. But could be more to come good there as well. So I want to talk in my remaining time here about safe streets and second chances. And it is a reentry program that we started with a coalition. It was Koch Industries, Right on Crime, the Texas Public Policy Foundation, Charles Koch Foundation, and Florida State University. And we hope it's going to become a game changer in reentry. And we're in 4 states right now. We're in Texas, we're in Kentucky, Florida, and Pennsylvania. The pilot just started. We're getting our first, we have 1,100 people coming out of prison in the next year that we're going to work with. Half are going to get what the state systems provide for people leaving prison in their jurisdictions, and the other half are going to get a program that our chief researcher, Carrie Pettis Davis, who's dedicated her life to these issues, is doing the research on this with her team. They've studied over 100,000 different programs around the world, and they think they have, through this 5 models, key models system, something that can be very revolutionary, but also common sense in reentry. And they're going to partner with local authorities, nonprofits who do reentry programs in their area to learn from them. So they're not going to come in top down like the federal government might and say, do this. They have ideas, but they're going to work with the people on the ground, and they're going to work with the people in the institutions, in the prisons. It's going to be sharing of knowledge and data and information. and it's going to go for the next year, like I said. It's open enrollment, basically, from our perspective. We don't limit anybody we're not cutting anybody out because of whatever crime they might have committed and are incarcerated for. The institutions might do that, but we're not doing that. And our whole goal is that we want to see that that day one of incarceration is when reentry begins. We've seen great results in the past several years in prisons where they have started to skill people out, maybe a year out, 6 months out, whatever it is. It's better than no time out. But we think that it really needs to start earlier on, and it needs to start day one if it could, and it needs to be something about giving people hope in a hopeless situation. And our goal ultimately would love to be able to be in all 50 states, and would also like to be able to, by 60 days in, everybody has a reentry plan tailored for what they need, whether it's therapeutic, education, skills, whatever it is. And so we're very excited about it. Like I said, we just started. It was interesting. This data you've already seen probably before, but one of the reasons why this is so important, reentry, is because basically everybody comes back to society. So it's in all our interests they come out better than they went in, and that's what hopefully our program, working with the local authorities and then scaling it up, we can help start to show a lot of progress in that area. Right now, it's not a great return here. When people come out, they go right back in for all the reasons I've been talking about with collateral consequences, et cetera. Our process, you can see it there. We've got partners we're working with that I mentioned. We've got reentry reform plans. We've also got the research and evidence-based practice at Florida State, and we have policy action. That's between I'm a lobbyist in criminal justice for Koch in a lot of ways, and then so is Right on Crime. So when we're in a state where we see a roadblock, we'll be able to hopefully go in and get that removed or start to help change the laws in certain areas that are keeping people from being able to reach their full potential and reenter society so they can be successful. And our goal is over time to get it in all 50 states. We'll see. And at the federal level, it's a huge lift. It's a long way to go, but we'll see what happens there. We did some initial data with people coming into to the program, and it was really didn't surprise me. I mean, being around people who are in prison, who I grew up with, and then working with them in the plastics factory, I mean, the people from way back then, they all wanted the same thing. There was just no way for them to get it back then. And this just reconfirms, basically, these findings in our initial intakes. I mean, yeah, people want to work, both men and women. They want to spend more time learning. They also want to have more productive relationships with their families and friends and their communities. They want to succeed. That's what they want. I believe that everybody in the system wants to succeed, and I'm not any Pollyannish guy. I'm a huge cynic, quite frankly. But on this one, I'm very optimistic. I've just seen enough of it and been around enough people who have changed when they've had a chance. So we're very excited about it. We hope over time it can become a game changer in the reentry space. And for us at the end of the day, this is all about helping people improve their lives. And we need acts of Congress. I always like to talk about this. It's very important to get some of the laws changed, but a lot of laws get passed that people don't follow, or they don't get implemented, or they're not used the way they should be, like in Kansas, where they have sentencing reform and they're supposed to take people to a clinic when they're arrested for drug offenses, but a lot of times in these different counties they don't. They bring them to county jails. They just disregard the law and no one enforces it. So you need laws passed, you need acts of Congress, but those are necessary but not sufficient. What we really need are all the acts of conscience that are people in this room, the advocates, people who are out there in the front lines working with, whether it's just in their communities on whatever it is, whatever their pet issue is. But if we have that, if we have people coming together and everybody plays a part in it, we look at it from a community perspective. The education system needs to be involved. Businesses need to be involved. And obviously, we need the government to pass laws and enforce them and have more just laws. So from Koch's perspective, put it on my Koch hat here, we're very focused on hiring the formerly incarcerated. We have been since I started with the company in 1995. We've hired people with criminal records since that time. We banned the box several years ago. And for us, it just makes sense. Going back to that 1 in 3 with a criminal record. If you're going to, as a global employer like we are with 120,000 people around the world and in all 50 states, if we're going to say, hey, well, we're only going to look at 2/3 of the potential applicant pool instead of all the rest of it, that's really short-sighted. And we've learned over time that we're big on data, and an arrest and a criminal record is a data point, but it shouldn't necessarily overwhelm every other data point about the person, and get to know them. And we've done that. And by saying that, we're not looking for credit. It just makes common sense. A lot of these things make common sense. If you educate people, if you give them a chance, you give them an opportunity, most people are going to try to succeed. And that's what I want to see in our criminal justice system and all our other systems too. But we need one that's much more based just on, besides data and evidence-based practices, it's just a much more redemptive system. As Brian Stevenson has said, each of us is more than the worst thing we've ever done. And I think I always try to keep that at top of mind when I'm dealing with anything, with any human being, but particularly when we talk about people in the prison system. Speaking for myself, it could have easily been me. And so I'm very driven by this issue for a lot of reasons. One reason is also my boss, Charles Koch, is so passionate about it. But for me, it's a huge issue. And I'm glad to be in front of people who also believe in this issue. And it's been great to speak with you. And with that, if there are questions, I'll take them. Otherwise, I will stop talking. We're done. Thank you.